This morning, we're really lucky to have Andy Hall from Stanford, both from the business school and the political science, and some combination of the two. And he's going to talk about the evolution of decentralized governance.
Cool. Thank you. Get started. Please feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. That's kind of what I'm used to. I'm going to start with just a brief historical story to motivate this, and then kind of get into the details with you. And please do stop me at any time. So what I'm showing you up on the screen here is the story of the Glorious Revolution. If you're from the UK, you probably know more about this story than me. But really what this story is about and why I think it's relevant to Web3 and decentralized governance is this is a story about Parliament in the UK taking power away from the monarchy and distributing it a little bit to a bunch of rich people in Parliament. And it was important because at the time of this thing called the Glorious Revolution, there had been these increasing challenges where the crown was constantly trying to raise money, mostly to fight foolish foreign wars. And over the previous centuries, it had gotten harder and harder to do this. So if you learn about, for example, Queen Elizabeth's very long reign, a lot of her reign was occupied with trying to figure out how to raise money. And that involved taxing and also taking loans from nobles throughout the country. And over time, it had gotten harder and harder to do this. And by the time of James II's reign, the crown had been forced to get very creative and basically had started to massively expropriate wealth in the country. And so they would say they wanted to take a loan. You wouldn't want to give the loan because you knew it was never going to get paid back. And they would tell you, well, you're required by law to give me this loan. It's still a loan, but you don't have a choice. And the interest rate's going to be basically zero. And oh, by the way, we're never going to pay it back. By the time of James II, this problem had become quite severe. And James II had essentially declared that he had the absolute authority to change any rules at any time that he wanted. And so if you didn't want to lend him money, too bad, he's going to take it from you anyway. And the Glorious Revolution, which had many complicated other causes, had this consequence that Parliament basically conspired to get rid of James. William and Mary were installed as the new monarchs, and as part of their installation, they somewhat informally agreed to this Declaration of Rights. And the Declaration of Rights included a list of grievances about what James II had been doing and the ways he'd been usurping powers that were rightly held by Parliament. And it also listed out the powers that Parliament felt were rightly its and not the monarchs. And William and Mary agreed to these rules, and that ushered in what's called the era of parliamentary supremacy, where power that had been centrally held by James II was distributed out to still a relatively small number of people, just to be super clear, but to a larger group of people across society that represented the largest wealth holders in the country. And somewhat as an almost accidental consequence of this revolution, the government was suddenly able to raise much more money than it had been before. Because now, people who had previously worried, well, if I get involved with the crown, I'm just going to get completely expropriated. Now they felt, we actually have this sort of constitution that guarantees me to some extent that I can actually do business with the government and I won't be hurt later because there's now a set of institutions that were laid out in this Declaration of Rights to make sure that my property rights were secured and that gave me a process of governance to be confident that if I had a problem, if I felt the government was doing something it shouldn't with my wealth, I had a means of recourse to correct the problem. And this led to a very large increase in economic growth in the UK, in England, and a sense that government was becoming in some ways more legitimate. And this is a story that's told, I think, quite interestingly in a really famous paper by North and Weingast that I recommend. So why am I telling you that story? The reason I'm telling you that story is because I think that these fundamental problems related to governance and related to holding too much centralized power has a lot to tell us about Web3 governance as well, which is something that I'm super interested in. And so you could think of these very large Web2 platforms that we all know so well as kind of like monarchies with pretty weak parliaments that don't do nothing, I want to be clear, but that don't have a lot of recourse to prevent the same kind of decisions being made by platforms that were being made by James II. So you think about these disputes, for example, between Epic Games and Apple, they're very much in this vein. It's sort of like Apple started to build an app store, people really wanted to be involved, then the app store got really, really big, kind of in the same way that James II got a lot of power. And now Apple's like, by the way, we're going to charge you a ton of money and there's nothing you can do about it and you have to follow all of our rules no matter what. And I think that it's very, very similar to the state of affairs at the time of the Glorious Revolution. There are lots of use cases where that might make sense for platforms. Obviously, it might be more efficient, it might just be easier, but the Glorious Revolution, I think, tells us something about what might happen if platforms actually figured out ways to distribute power a little bit more. And the two things that I think are most important that I think about in my work, which I'm going to tell you about, the first is this sense of social legitimacy, that if a platform is making decisions that affect all of society, like, for example, what we're allowed to say online, that it might be more legitimate for those rules not to be made by a single person or a single company, but rather by a larger group of people. And second, more in line with the Glorious Revolution itself, this idea of economic growth, that there might be people, on the margin at least, who aren't investing as much time or effort in becoming a creator or a developer or a seller on a platform because they're worried about being expropriated in precisely the way that the crown expropriated people prior to the Glorious Revolution. And so I think there are these reasons to care about whether we can implement effective decentralized governance at scale to solve problems like these two, and potentially, therefore, to sort of increase the level of social legitimacy we perceive in these platforms, and to encourage a bunch of new growth and innovation. And just to give so that this talk is going to be about how can we do that and what does political economy, which is the world I come from, have to say about that. And just to give the bottom line up front, the thing I'm going to try to kind of repeatedly convince you of is that everything we know about how governance has evolved over time in society suggests to us that it's going to have to, however we build these governance systems, it's going to have to involve a lot of indirect democracy. And this idea that we can have everyone in a protocol, on a platform, whatever, vote on everything, I think is not going to work. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get into that, let me just super quickly explain who I am. I'm super excited to visit here and to get to know you all and kind of like how I came to work in this area. So by day, I'm a political scientist, a political economist. I do mostly data-driven research on how to build democratic systems. So just to give you like a few examples, like recently my lab has studied, so what happens when you let people vote by mail? How much does that affect participation? Actually, turns out it has very little effect on participation. We go out and we measure the ideological positions of all the state legislators in the country, all the candidates running for state legislature to try to understand, where's polarization coming from, what is causing it among our politicians. Done some work linking property records to voter turnout data to understand these kind of like differential participation of homeowners in local politics. I'm just giving you these examples because they're all about these same governance problems that turn out to appear in Web3 all the time. So like, polarization, conflict, disproportionate representation of certain participants over others. These are all sort of like classic problems. And part of how I became interested in the space is that on the side, I've also been working in tech for the last 5 years on these types of governance problems in large platforms. So primarily, I've done quite a bit of work with Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, which obviously has pretty severe governance problems. And I've been really interested in those problems and in the fact that they actually overlap with these governance problems from society. The way I got into Web3 and the way I ended up in this room giving this talk is that through my work in tech, I became really interested and I was asked to do a bunch of work to understand how groups online are self-governing. And I was Googling around one night and I stumbled on this post. I don't know if any of you know this guy, 0x Dennis, he's at MakerDAO. He's brilliant. He wrote a super long post in the MakerDAO forum about the problem of getting people to participate in protocol governance. And the post is super thoughtful, it's super clearly written, encourage you all to check it out. But what blew my mind was that the problems he laid out were just completely isomorphic to the problems we study in political science about countries or cities or states running elections. Problems that you can't get people to participate, that it's too expensive for them to participate, that they don't know what's going on, that it's a pain to learn about the issues. These are classic political science questions. And I became super interested in whether we could improve decentralized governance by taking some of the things we learned from 2,000 years of studying democracy and apply them in this space. And so that then led me, I met Porter Smith here at a16z. We just wrote this piece for a16z on this idea of what does the history of governance tell us about how to implement governance for Web3. And a lot of what I'm about to tell you about comes from that piece. Okay, so let me get into the meat of the talk for today. When you look out at governance in the Web3 space, if you talk to people who are working on governance, I think there's sort of there's obviously lots of different issues out there, but there's three deeply interrelated issues that come up all the time. The number one issue that I hear all the time is like, we can't get people to participate. And then that's closely related and in some sense causes and is also caused by these other two problems, which is that when no one's participating, small groups with concentrated interests can sort of like threaten to hijack the process in various ways. And at the same time, if you don't have enough people participating, you're also worried that the decentralized workforce, or the bureaucracy as we would call it in politics, might go off and do things that you as the token holder or the voter don't agree with. And because no one's participating, no one's monitoring that. And even if they're actually behaving fairly well, there may not be trust because you're not actually around monitoring, and that leads to suspicion. And so if you can't solve these three interrelated problems, which every democratic society in the history of the world has stumbled upon, then you're not going to create that sense of social legitimacy, that this was a legitimate process that led to a legitimate outcome. And you might also have these problems of growth because this isn't a well-governed system. It's not a system that you can trust. Of course, there's lots of other problems too, like governance attacks and the like, that are exacerbated by these issues. Societies across history have found again and again and again that you simply can't govern through direct democracy at any kind of meaningful scale. And the reason for this is kind of obvious. The reason is that it's totally irrational for any individual person to spend substantial amounts of time monitoring and learning about each vote if they're very unlikely to be pivotal in the outcome of that vote. And so even if you only have, say, 40 people voting, it's already starting to be pretty unlikely that your vote's going to make the difference. And so why on earth would you spend hours each day studying these abstruse issues and trying to vote on them? So this is often in political economy called the paradox of voting. Downs talked about rational inattention. It's a classic problem in all voting systems, and it's really cropped up quite severely in Web3 because there's been a pretty heavy reliance on this ethos of direct democracy, which I think is kind of a mistake. And part of why I think it's kind of a mistake is people want to say that if you're using direct democracy, it's more decentralized, but it's not if people aren't actually participating. And once you have that kind of voter apathy, we tend to know what happens next. And we're seeing this more and more, I think, now in Web3, is pretty small groups of people who can benefit from getting certain things passed are going to start pushing to pass things, knowing that many people may not be paying attention. And we've seen examples of this, like there's an example in Maker where a small group of people tried to get something passed, it didn't pass, so they just tried repeatedly. And when you have this sort of like weakness that comes from very few other people participating, you become vulnerable to those kinds of problems. And as I mentioned before, it also makes it very hard to perform oversight. If no one is participating, then who's around to assess whether the decisions that are being made or the actions that are being taken on a day-to-day basis outside the voting context are good or not? And so this is why I think it's really important to explore how we can use indirect democracy to make these systems work. And this, again, I think completely parallels history. If you look at the history of how organizations govern themselves, you see very early on, long ago in history, a pretty rapid iteration past direct democracy. And so this is sort of a picture of the early days of the British East India Company. The East India Company had an elected board of directors. It was not direct democracy. And it came out of a history, there had been a history of smaller companies with shareholders voting on things directly, but it was 5 or 10 people. And so it was kind of like you could all get in a room and hash things out. What started to happen is more people wanted to invest in these things, and as these enterprises became larger, there's almost instantly this problem where some of the shareholders who were voting on stuff were also the managers of the company and knew everything about what was going on. And some of them had other jobs, and this was a side venture for them, and they weren't around as much. And they became very worried that because they weren't around, they were getting screwed over. And so very, very quickly, they said, this makes no sense. I can't show up every time and vote on everything, but I don't want to be expected to and not show up and then get screwed over. So I would like there to be a representative body, and I'd like to be able to vote for someone to be there on a day-to-day basis when I can't be, and make sure that my interests are represented. And that's a super important evolution in how corporate governance worked. And of course, we know the same thing has happened in societies all across the world, not just in the US, though of course here in the US we tend to learn about it. For the US context, this is a picture of James Madison. You know, they put a bunch of work into thinking about how you could go create a representative system where there'd be linkages between the people voting and the people who are representing them. And we're starting to see this in Web3, and I think it's a really important evolution that I want to talk about. Yeah, please.
You're talking about history and direct democracy failing in history, but presumably it was technologically just more infeasible to run a direct democracy historically. In terms of just the costs of doing this. So for
sure. So if you thought that the main reason direct democracy hasn't worked in the past is because it was too difficult to perform the act of voting, then I think you're totally right. Like, technology should facilitate a massively quicker and easier way for everyone to vote. The problem whenever we've studied this, and it actually kind of comes up in that paper I was mentioning to you that I did on vote by mail, is that whenever we study within the plausible range of ways you'd run an election, what gets people to turn out more or less, it has way more to do with the cognitive constraints of figuring out all these things, and this sense that a lot of people have that, like, I don't want to have to deal with this, it shouldn't be my job, and I have other stuff I want to do. And much less about whether I have to go somewhere to vote or whether I can vote, you know, on my computer, leaving aside obviously security issues. Those cognitive barriers are, I think, much larger. And so, and this is, I think, and I'll talk a little bit about this, I think one of the interesting fallacies that I see all the time in American politics, which is playing out again in Web3, is this idea that, like, well, we can put out all this information because everything's transparent. And so you're going to know everything about what the delegates are up to, or you're going to know everything about what we're voting on, and so there's no problem. And in the same way, I mean, basically every year an undergrad comes to my office and says, I'm going to fix democracy by making an app that tells you what your representative is up to. And the reason those things have very little impact is because my problem isn't access to data, it's time and expertise to analyze the data and figure out what's going on, what I should do about it. So I mean, I've hung out quite a bit in Maker. I don't hold any MKR or anything like that, but I hang out there sometimes. The stuff they vote on is insanely abstruse. There's like these flow charts with the Cayman Islands in them and stuff. And it's like, I don't even know where to start. And so whether I can push a button to vote or whether I have to link my wallet and do all this other work is not the key. It is a constraint, but it is not the binding constraint, I think.
Let me ask another kind of devil's advocate style question.
For sure.
Like, within the US context, or maybe within like Western democracies in general, is the trend toward more direct democracy or less? Because I would have said it was like we're on a slow trajectory toward more direct democracy.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% right. We are on that trajectory. And I think that there's two very different parts to that trajectory, one of which I think is unequivocally a good idea, and one of which might be a terrible idea, although the jury's out. The part that's unequivocally a good idea is making sure everyone's allowed to vote and can vote, because that's critical to the functioning of a democratic system. That's not really about direct democracy, but that's a really important part of this democratic trend. So of course in the US, questionable today whether exactly what it means to be a democracy or whether the US is one, but it's very obvious that it certainly wasn't one before the Voting Rights Act. And so that's a trajectory towards more democracy, but not necessarily towards more direct democracy. What the other trend we've seen, what you might be getting at, is sort of this idea that we should all vote to nominate candidates for office, which didn't used to be the case, or it used to be that parties could kind of hash things out behind closed doors. There's some trend towards more ballot initiatives or referendums, which are another form of that direct democracy. And there's definitely this rhetoric around that's like a good thing. Most of that trend is actually pretty old. So like the development of those initiatives and referendums is actually earlier in time, but now we're kind of stuck with them, like where I live in California, where we vote on 100 of them each election. I think most people who've studied them from different ways tend to come out on the conclusion that it's generally not a good idea to have a lot of stuff like that. There's a huge trade-off though. If you don't have referendums and you don't have initiatives, you worry about the process being captured by special interests or by politicians who maybe are missing things that are important in society. On the other hand, when you start to open things up to these direct votes, you worry that it's less biased in the sense that like more issues can be considered that special interests might otherwise quash or something. But you might make really bad uninformed decisions. And paradoxically, and it's exactly like the problems I'm thinking about in Web3, you can actually accidentally empower special interests more because no one knows what's going on. And so this is what you see in California. If you look at the things that are proposed in these initiatives, they're impossible to parse. It's like, should a doctor be required to be present for dialysis at private dialysis clinics? I have no idea. I don't know the first thing about that. It turns out that whole initiative, which has been proposed on like 5 years in a row now, is a battle between two different special interest groups that has, nothing to do with the things most people are worried about. And so I think most people who study these systems tend to conclude it's a bad idea to have too much of that, but it's also a bad idea to have none of it. But you don't have to look far to come up with examples where that kind of direct voting seems like it leads to pathological outcomes. Brexit perhaps being one. Obviously, some people are into Brexit, but it's actually like not a very popular policy today, and yet got passed. Okay, so I want to talk about, with that motivation in mind, what are some concrete things we could do from where we are today to change decentralized governance in interesting ways. The first has to do with these systems of delegation, which are already being developed in some DAOs, and taking the next step and making them into like robust systems of delegation. I'm going to talk about how we might be able to do that by giving stronger incentives to people to become delegates. The second is building out more complex systems that guarantee representation to different groups. And so like every democracy in the world does this in some way. We're starting to see, like there's some examples of it now in Web3 that are interesting. So I'll talk a little bit about that as the second idea. And the third is building up these systems of oversight that I think are essential to creating trust between the workforce and the token holders. So these are the three things I want to focus on for the rest of the talk. Okay. So the first one I want to talk about is like how we can improve delegation as it exists today. So as I said, there are some DAOs now using delegation, by which I mean you can take your tokens and you can delegate them to another person and say, hey, I'd like you to vote on my behalf, so you get my voting power. This is an idea, by the way, that's been around forever, and it's called proxy voting in corporate governance. Though it can be implemented in technical ways in Web3 that are different and super, super interesting. And what I think is important to recognize, but not necessarily super obvious when you look at delegation in the Web3 space, is that it is like representative democracy in the sense that the person you delegate to, it's similar in a way to if you voted for someone to be your representative. You are empowering that person to take decisions on your behalf or to take votes on your behalf. And so that opens up a really interesting toolkit that we don't have in direct democracy, where we think about how can you make that relationship work well? How can you as the delegator have confidence that the person you delegate to is going to do the kinds of things you want them to do? And that's called the accountability problem in the study of democracy, and it's sort of like a super classic age-old thing we've studied a lot. And so we have a lot of ideas about how you might make it work that I want to tell you about. And I'll just say the history of how that developed looks pretty similar to how delegation is developing so far. Right now, we're in this really early phase. There aren't a lot of delegates. It's kind of hard to convince people to want to do it. Most of the money or the tokens being delegated are coming from a relatively small source of people. It's not dissimilar from how representation arose in democratic systems. And what we saw in democratic systems is this evolution towards professionalized legislatures, which is, I don't think, in any means entirely a good thing, but I think it's in some ways inevitable and necessary. And I want to kind of talk about how by making the delegation process more professionalized, to use this political science term, you might get that stronger sense of accountability that you need if you're going to convince people that indirect democracy can work for Web3. So this is a figure from Porter in my piece that I think tries to explain why this is important. And the idea is if you can create a system where your representatives, the people you delegate to, perceive that they have strong incentives to do the hard work and like figure out what the right decision is, make the right proposal, make the right decisions, then that induces token holders to trust the system more and to believe in it more. And that gives them incentives to want to be involved and to want to be engaged, which strengthens the incentives for the delegates to do a good job, because now they're thinking, if I don't do a good job, these token holders are really paying attention. They'll fire me. They'll delegate to someone else. And so when you can create that virtuous cycle, you can get a very well-governed system. And it relies crucially on this idea that I, as the person you delegated to, that I care about that I want you to keep delegating to me, and that I don't want to get fired from that job. That's totally critical to the accountability problem. And where we see accountability fall apart in the real world, which happens all the time, it's from some combination of either I, as the person running for office, don't actually care about winning because it's just something I'm doing for whatever reason, or I am secure in the knowledge that whatever I do, you're not going to be able to fire me. Maybe I know that no one turns out to vote, so it doesn't matter. So you have to create this virtuous cycle where I want to win re-election, and I know that if I don't do a good job, I won't. And that's how you create accountability. And we're not really there yet with the delegates, I don't think, although I do think the people, at least that I've seen, acting as delegates are working very hard. But as a system and as a thing other people can trust to work, we haven't gotten to that point yet. And I think there are some concrete things we could do to try to get to that point. And so the very first is, I think it's essential for the reasons I just laid out, you got to make being a delegate a job people want. That sounds kind of obvious, but it's really important. And that could be some combination. Of course, compensation is part of that. And there's a huge literature on how and when you should pay politicians with this exact problem in mind. If you pay them too much, maybe you get sort of corrupt individuals wanting to get the job and cheating in the election and stuff. If you pay them too little, though, you don't get people who necessarily care, and you don't give them that strong incentive to not want to get fired in the future. But there's other things beyond compensation that might be more important. So obviously one is just prestige, this idea that if I hold this job, it's gonna be good for my future. It's something that's socially valuable. It's something that's professionally valuable. It's also, I think, about giving them a clear job to do. So I think one of the really interesting challenges I've seen in Maker, which is I think the very first DAO to really build a delegation system, is that it's been a little bit hard to figure out what the delegates are supposed to do. And there's at least some people whose view is, well, the delegates should really be taking over in the sense of articulating a vision for Maker and putting in proposals based on that vision. There's other people who think no, the delegates are just one part of the system and they're basically just there to vote on proposals that other people make. And I think figuring out exactly what their job is essential to making it something that more people are going to want to do. And of course, the last part of this that's important is, I think there's quite a few people who don't want to be delegates because they worry that that carries with it some kind of liability, and there's been some work on insuring them against that liability, which I think is essential. So that's one chunk of things I think is interesting to think about that we can pull in from governance in other places and times, is this idea that if you're going to use indirect democracy, if you buy my argument that direct democracy is not going to work at scale, you've got to get representatives in, Once you have representatives in, though, it's only going to work if you create this virtuous cycle where they want to be representatives, they want to keep their jobs, and you're paying attention and you're going to fire them if they don't do their jobs. So that's the first chunk. The second chunk relates really closely to that. There's this idea of liquid democracy that I think is incredibly interesting in Web3. And so I don't want to assume everyone has necessarily seen it, but this idea that was sort of like you delegate to people on certain decisions. In some forms of it, you could delegate to different people on different decisions. But the idea is that whether it's to multiple people or to one or whatever, the whole idea is it's continuous. So it's like I give you some money, I can take it back if I don't like the way you're voting. And that seems very appealing. It's cool, first of all, because it's something we couldn't really implement in the real world before now. So that's cool. And it seems like it has this appealing aspect that it creates this very sharp form of accountability that I can fire you at any time. Fire might not be exactly the right word, but you know what I mean. In the case of elements, you could actually fire them because if they go below some threshold, they fall out of the council. But you're gonna, on a day-to-day basis, change your mind. Whereas as a voter, you're stuck waiting until the next election, right? And if it's a US Senate election, you might have to wait 5 years. And there's a sense that you therefore have very little control as a voter over your senator. And so liquid democracy sounds very appealing in this regard. It comes though, I think there's a trade-off that hasn't necessarily been that appreciated, which is that if I'm a delegate and you've given me my tokens and maybe I get paid based on how many tokens are delegated to me or whatever, you want me to kind of like invest in studying things and making proposals, and that's like a long run commitment. And if I am essentially up for election every day for the rest of time because you can undelegate for me at any time, that might actually erode my incentives to make long-term investments because I'm being elected literally every day. And so you see this trade-off very sharply in the real world, and there's lots of actually good theoretical work on how you balance the frequency of elections with these two forces in mind. Because we definitely have a sense that if the elections are too spaced apart, you have too little control. But we also have a sense that when the elections are super close in time to one another, it creates very perverse incentives for representatives. And if you look at like Congress, there's like a famous line of argument that congressional elections are too frequent. Members of House are always running for election. That changes the way they behave. It makes them pander more. It makes them invest in longer term, more serious policy less, and so forth. And so I think thinking through that problem for delegation is super, super important. And it may be that rather than having this like continuous liquid democracy, you might want to have some amount of guaranteed term lengths for delegates. And you could think of creative ways to balance that with liquid democracy in ways that could be kind of cool. The last thing I'll just say on it is it also might have a voter behavior benefit, which is that we know voters tend to participate more if there's like a set time at which everyone votes because it creates a social phenomenon around voting. And that's something that's really missing in liquid democracy. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, do you view like delegated proof of stake as being kind of a different category? Because it's not usually called liquid democracy, but it has the same property that you can change who you delegate your stake to all the time. I mean, maybe stakers are doing a slightly simpler task where they're supposed to follow maybe a more set of rules, but they do have some like policy choices, right?
Yeah. I'm super interested in that. I don't have a good answer yet. I've been kind of like studying a little bit of that recently because it seems so important. And I worry, I don't know as much about proof of stake, but I have worried at times, like if no one is monitoring, could really bad things happen. And so I think one of the things you're raising that could be really interesting to explore is sort of like, how does the optimal rate of ability to redelegate, how is that a function of the task that the delegate is performing? Just off the top of my head, I would say, and I don't know exactly how this applies to proof of stake situations, but off the top of my head, I would say the more you're expecting them to do a concrete action on a concrete day that doesn't have like dynamic long-term consequences, the more frequent you should probably want the ability to redelegate. And the more you want them to be looking to the future and making long-run investments and understanding issues, probably the less frequent you want the delegation to be. That would be my guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not sure anybody really has like studied it that carefully or knows, but it seems like the concern people express more is actually that people won't move their stake away from a bad staker. Like that people will be way too sticky and won't be paying attention.
Yes, totally.
If someone's attacking, like they won't all flock somewhere else.
Yeah, and that seems especially severe if you're in this world where you can stake, but then you get these derivatives and you can go off and play with them and you don't really care about what you staked. I think that's and that actually raises kind of a broader point I wanted to make, which is I've set this whole thing up about how indirect democracy helps, but of course, indirect democracy still only works under pretty optimistic conditions where enough people, they don't have to make every decision, but they do have to make this one decision really well, which is they have to decide who to vote for. And we see representative systems fail all the time because voters don't do that very well. And so there's still a pretty optimistic part here about how do you get the delegators to do a good job. And what you're raising is sort of classic problem in voting systems where, well, I don't care. I still have this collective action problem. My vote in an election has very little impact on the outcome. Maybe if I staked to someone, but I'm only one of many people who stake to them, it's the same thing.
I think the issue I was raising is just that people are really sticky.
Yes.
And I mean, I guess they're like that in Congress too, where they re-elect the incumbents like almost all the time. But definitely that's the perennial fear with delegated group states that just like set it and forget it and then totally offline.
I think that's a huge challenge, and I think that's in the small amount of empirical work I've seen on liquid democracy in other settings, it seems like it has two pathologies. One is that like there's the super optimistic idea that you choose issue by issue who to delegate to, and in reality, people were like delegating to one person, and not only that, but people were herding and they were all delegating to the same person, which could be quite bad, especially for information aggregation purposes. And similarly, they weren't reevaluating their delegation decisions over time. And I agree, it is quite isomorphic to these voting problems where you vote and then you pay no attention and then you vote the same way again. And maybe it's for the incumbent, maybe it's for the same party you always vote for, whatever. Some of the solutions, I think, have to do with what I'm talking about here, is sort of like, one is making voting like a social enterprise where you all do it at the same time and you talk about it, I think is important. The third part here I think is relevant too, is sort of this idea of a free press. So it's like, how do you get people to pay attention in large elections? I think in general, if you looked out at these voting systems in the real world, you'd have the same exact concern you raised. And if you just predicted from theory, you might predict they don't work at all. And so it's kind of surprising that they actually work. Of course, we have tons of complaints about how they work, but they work better than most other governance systems we've been able to come up with, alluding to the famous Churchill quote. And part of why they work better than we expect is if you make it this phenomenon, people do actually pay attention and they do participate. And part of the way we've done that, part of it is having everyone elected at the same time, so creating term lengths, that seems critical. But another part of it is like this other stuff that goes on around elections, and a critical part of that is this idea of the free press. This idea that you get accessible information about what's going on that helps you understand and care about the issues, and given whatever your values are, figure out where you fit in. Like, are you like this party or that party? And this, I think, is something that is missing right now in these early forms of decentralized governance that I think will become really important. And this is kind of one of my hobby horses, is what a lot of DAOs talk about, I noticed today, is, oh, we're going to build a dashboard that's going to tell you what your delegate's been up to. It's going to tell you about all the proposals and who voted how, and we're going to track the participation rate of your delegate and stuff like that. It's definitely useful, but it's nowhere close to what we need in terms of a free press to make elections function, because what I need is not data. I need to understand the implications, and these decisions are quite complex. I need sort of like independent actors, ideally with some kind of profit motivation if possible, to be studying what's going on and telling me about it, so I can say, well, my values are over here, therefore I support this proposal or I don't. And this is where I think this will be a really interesting evolution to see. First of all, are there ways to make that service profitable? If not, is it something that can be subsidized like it often is in the real world? If it is subsidized, who should be subsidizing it? Like, is it at the Ethereum layer? Is it at inside a very large DAO, but not inside a small one? I'm not sure. But I think if we look at what's missing from getting representation off the ground, I think that kind of making delegates want to do the job and then subjecting them to important levels of scrutiny and analysis, I think, is the only way you make a representative system work. Any questions on?
Yeah, quick question on that. Can you give us a sense of what you actually think the sort of design problem for those sort of like auditors or curators or something is? Like, because one's first thought is, okay, maybe there's a profitable market for somebody to just be doing that, like, auditing or curation if they have particular skill in doing it. But then maybe they're subject to some sort of, side payments. That means they might like manipulate their point. What's the frame of the problem?
I don't know yet. I think if you look at analogs in the real world, you come away kind of stunned that it works at all. And I would say it works way better than I would have expected. There's one super optimistic story, which I think you were alluding to, which is that there's a competitive market for the provision of news. And that does seem to work in some cases, where to the extent consumers are actually willing to pay for news, you can get good market properties from that. But of course, we worry that there's tons of pathologies where actually it turns out that people don't value high quality news very much and they view it as entertainment, and then we get problems from that. And so I don't know yet in the Web3 space what the nature of the sort of like consumer demand for this kind of analysis would be. I think it might be kind of high only because in kind of a previous era of democratic politics where there were kind of like high levels of interest in civic responsibility, there was pretty high demand for it at the time. And you might think with the sort of like optimism around Web3 among certain dedicated participants who do have quite a bit of money, there might be a market there. And then you could create competition and reputations for high quality news that lead you to sell more of your news.
Footnote, it's funny, like, so news is one good analog of this. I was almost thinking more of like analysts, sort of providing information to shareholders or something, where there's like a big, value incentive associated with getting it right in a way that with like some types of political decision making, maybe there isn't, it's too much of a tragedy of the commons. But I guess you're right that like, for most types of decisions, it's actually the news that's providing this sort of oversight. Super interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, we should talk more about the analyst thing because you see some of that happening. It would be really interesting to understand where it's going to head. Okay. All right. So the second part is kind of like constitutional engineering. So right now, in most of Web3, though not all, you have this very, very basic setup, right, where the token holders do everything or decide on everything. Corporate governance to some extent has worked the same way in the sense that the shareholders are thought to be supreme. Of course, these days, there's been this enormous highly vitriolic debate over whether other stakeholders beyond shareholders should matter or not, and how, and if so, how. And it's just a huge, huge deal in corporate governance right now, with no obvious answer as far as I can tell so far. And we see the same thing happening, unsurprisingly, in Web3, where there, I think, are well-founded concerns that it's actually hard to get a meaningfully decentralized, self-governing community off the ground if it's dominated by a set of large token holders. So there's there's a famous Vitalik post about this. Lots of other people have pointed this out too, that if you rely entirely on token voting, it might be hard to create that sense of legitimacy and that sense of sort of a widespread shared interest in the success of this enterprise when all the power and all the rents are concentrated like that. And so we've seen people explore a lot of possible ways to address this, to bring in meaningful roles for people who aren't large token holders. And some of those people could be the people who actually work for the protocol, could be other kinds of active contributors, people who are making good rather than bad posts on the forum and so forth, users of the protocol, small token holders, We see the same exact thing in democracies. And so we've seen an evolution over time in how systems are set up in ways to guarantee, in some sense, representation for certain groups. And I think that this is heading in exactly the same direction. And once again, I think what's interesting is Web3 is kind of like rediscovering issues that have been around for a long time, but also tweaking them with, with new technology. And so just to give you one example of this, because I find if like me, you're from the US, you may not know about this because the US is an outlier in this, but huge fraction of the world actually has quotas in place for women in legislatures. In fact, I think it's a majority of the world, maybe not by population. And so I think this is one really important example of where you engineer a system and you don't just say, we're just gonna let voting do everything. You say from the outset, we're gonna design the system to guarantee a certain type of representation. And I'm just offering this as one example. There's tons of other examples you can think about. Bicameralism in the US is basically a guarantee to the states that that the smaller states will have an outsized portion of power. Majority-minority districts in the US are supposed to be a guarantee that minority populations have representatives of their own by giving them a majority vote within a certain district. There's lots of other examples. So you can build a system to weigh different voices in different ways. And we're starting to see this, I think, because there is some perception that it might be bad to rely overly heavily on token-based voting. You're seeing the evolution of new systems like this. So a couple of examples. So one within the framework of token voting, of course, is just to give certain groups or certain people more votes through retroactive airdrops for people who've contributed to the community or something like that. So that's one way to try to get at these problems. But what we're seeing now, I think, which is in some ways more interesting and more creative, is the creation of new governing bodies, where the selection into that body or the power of those bodies is not directly related to the number of tokens you hold. And so Optimism's Citizens House was one kind of interesting, optimistic, if you will, attempt at this, where the idea was there's going to be token voting, and then there's also going to be this other chamber that you get into not based on how many tokens you hold, but based on your contributions to the community. We'll give you a special token that gives you the right to be in that house, and the Citizens House is going to make a set of decisions about the community, particularly around public funding for projects, separately from the token holders. So it's a kind of bicameralism where you're creating, it's almost like, the token holders are the Senate or the House of Lords or whatever you want to call it, and the Citizens House is like the lower chamber. It's a weak analogy, but it's sort of there. And you can imagine going much further and creating different kinds of assemblies that have different powers, where membership in that assembly is a function of something other than the tokens that you hold. And depending on your problem and which stakeholders you think are important, you could design it to make sure that those stakeholders are represented. Finally, this is where we haven't seen as much yet, but just based on the history of governance in the real world, I would hypothesize that we will see it, is this idea that, well, if you're going to rely on a system of representation through delegation, then that opens up this possibility of actually defining groups of delegates. So instead of just saying anyone can become a delegate, you could say there's going to be a group of delegates who have explicit groups that they represent because they're from that group, because they're familiar with that group, whatever. And they're going to have some amount of voting power that's not just a function of how much has been delegated to them freely by people. And this is kind of like the quota system from the past slide. So you can imagine you think there's a group, maybe it's small token holders, I don't know, could be any group, who you think is underrepresented in the process. You could guarantee them a delegate, and that delegate could have a certain amount of power. These are things I expect to see happen as the stuff evolves. Okay, last part I want to talk about, and then I'll try to wind up here, is this problem of oversight. Okay, and as I said before, when you have a system that relies on direct democracy and participation is inevitably very low, one of the problems you then face is that you have this people get this sense, not always justified by reality, that the people who are working for the organization are not being monitored and could be doing all kinds of bad stuff that's bad for me as a token holder that I'm not seeing, because I have this sense that the process is kind of like run out of control. And this is exactly the problem I was talking about earlier when I talked about the East India Company and why boards of directors were set up, precisely because as the number of shareholders got larger, the ones who weren't managers of the company became obsessed with this problem that the managers were secretly conspiring against them. Sometimes because it was true and it happened, other times because it's natural to become suspicious when another group of people has incentives to screw you over and you're not able to monitor them. And this has been happening to some extent in Maker. I'm not an expert on this, so I'll just say my impression is that actually the core units have been working quite diligently and hard, but there is not a lot of oversight. And this has led to all kinds of dramatic accusations that the system is growing and growing and growing out of proportion with its needs, that the budget is being overrun as a result. It's a classic governance problem. And it's the same thing we see happen in politics. And so in the US, we have exactly this problem, that there are a ton of people, whether accurately or inaccurately, hold a very strong perception that the bureaucracy, which is the political equivalent of the workforce, is unmonitored and doing all kinds of things that voters and taxpayers and whatever don't want. And there's this whole political movement, right? I'm showing a particularly dramatic example here. Steve Bannon called it deconstruct the administrative state. I don't think he turned out to be super successful, but there's this idea, and it's hardly unique to the US, that when you can't monitor, this kind of suspicion and anger and distrust festers. And that I think will be a huge problem in any decentralized organization that grows to a large enough size. And I think it's precisely some of the growing pains. Maker seems to always be first in exploring these problems and coming up with pretty interesting solutions to them. This is, I think, exactly the problem they're facing. It's sort of like, if you don't have a ton of participation and a ton of monitoring, how do you create that trust? And I just want to emphasize, creating those mechanisms of oversight is critical, not only because it prevents bad actors from doing stuff within the system, but also because it creates trust. So even if the workforce is already doing a good job, that's actually not sufficient. You need them to be doing a good job and to be trusted by the token holders for the thing to work in the long run. And so creating oversight is important even if you think today the system is working well. This is kind of the idea of trust, but verify. And so how could we do that? I think if you had, look again to other systems that have representative democracy, it's some combination of the delegates themselves are tasked with some amount of oversight and they're given staff with which to perform that oversight, or they delegate in turn to some kind of committee, like an audit committee, or a group of people whose job it is to study and to monitor what's going on in the workforce. And there was a kind of a proposal like that at Maker that became super, super controversial. I don't know if any of you followed it. But there are these ideas out there to start forming these kinds of things, and it's supernatural. Right? That's like the job, one of the jobs, nominally at least, of corporate boards of directors is precisely to perform this sort of oversight. Yeah.
Do you think there's any opportunity, just like through the public nature of blockchains, to monitoring that actually be easier than traditional government settings?
Yes, I definitely think so. Of course, there's always like what you can see and what goes on in the private chats and stuff. But yeah, I think it's a very different starting point. I think it's a big challenge. A big challenge you saw in the history of corporate governance, which you also definitely see in democratic governance, are these information asymmetries, where the people working on a day-to-day basis know so much more about what's going on that they can run circles around you as sort of like an outside shareholder or even an independent member of the board because they just know so much more. To start at at baseline, the outside people couldn't see anything about what was going on. And then there's the growth of all these rules around how audits work and what kinds of information have to be disclosed and SEC regulation and all that. Same thing in democratic governance, like public records laws, et cetera. And they're hugely burdensome and they don't work super well. They're way better than nothing. But yeah, I think blockchain is starting from a much higher potential level where lots of the stuff that you want to know about is already public. And what you need over and above that is the sort of analysis and research and interpretation of it, which in some ways I think is the easier barrier. compared to systems where the actors have strong incentives to hide everything. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Okay, so those are like the 3 potential paths forward that I think are like both interesting and promising and likely, I think, to occur as governance moves forward. I just wanted to stop here at the end so we can turn to kind of discussion and questions with just a few notes about where I'm hoping my research and other political economy research could go towards in this space. So I think the most obvious and important thing for people studying governance in this space is going to be to try to develop a science of this, sort of like what is happening and why is it happening, so that we can understand how to intervene and to make the things we think should happen. And so we need we have a bunch of ideas from the study of governance in other areas, but we need to develop them and test them in this space to start to get kind of like towards a mature idea. So I've thrown out a bunch of hypotheses, but how do we actually start to test them and figure out what works? And so some of the things I just want to list out in this space that I think are particularly important and interesting to me at least is sort of this question of participation, who participates and why, how can we get more people to become informed and to participate in good ways, and where I think Web3 is different from what's come before is in the fine-grained incentives you can give to people through the way you design the tokens, through the way you design the system. And so that's new and totally different. And so how do we develop a science of how to do that in good ways for governance, I think is super interesting. Second is like kind of coming from the study of legislatures where I spent a lot of time is sort of like, how do you make this representative system function well? So if the first question is about how you get voters to function well, the second is how do you get delegates to function well? And how do you organize conflict? So we have this idea from the study of politics that conflict is inevitable, and that if you're going to have conflict over how to make a collective decision, which we see all the time in Web3, of course, how do you make it stable so that through you channel the conflict into a process that, one, is stable in the sense that it leads to predictable outcomes that everyone agrees to and views as legitimate, and so that the conflict itself actually informs people about the stakes. And so if we go back to this question of like, how do you get people to pay attention and know when to unstake or when to delegate, when to undelegate? A lot of what we think happens in politics is that by having a debate in public about the key issues and sharpening the, like, what are the actual disagreements that we have, is how people learn and how you get to a kind of structured political system. And so how do we get these sort of like clear conflicts to be channeled and to be stable in this way is, I think, a really important question. And as I mentioned, just the sort of like early work that Dan and I have been doing on this is we're developing this dashboard that, in addition to showing you kind of like who's participating and when across DAOs, it's also going to explore what these patterns of delegation look like across DAOs that use delegation, as well as what the actual votes on proposals look like and what the kind of like structure of preferences over those votes is. So I just want to show you some very, very initial stuff that I did on the airplane yesterday on this note. So what I'm showing you here, this is super preliminary, is we take all the proposals that are voted on in each DAO. And so we have addresses for the voters, and we have the different proposals, and we have, you know, the number of tokens voted. So you can think about it's like a matrix where the rows, let's say, are the proposals and the columns are the addresses, and each cell is like the number of tokens voted in favor. That opens the door to there's a very long and I think super fun research tradition in political science and political economy about interpreting voting data and clustering people into groups, into coalitions, essentially. And so a very easy, it's not the fanciest way to do it, but a very easy way to start to do that is to just do a principal components decomposition to this matrix of votes. So what I'm showing you here is, and if you haven't done that before, it doesn't matter. This is, I'm showing you the scree plot that just, it gives you a sense of how structured conflict is. This is for compound. And so the fewer dimensions you need to explain the variation in these votes, the more structured we think the conflict is. And what's really interesting here is we think the US Congress is super one-dimensional. Not entirely. There are other issues that matter, but the variation in how legislators cast roll call votes in Congress is largely explained by this single first dimension that has to do with like how left-wing or right-wing they are. The scree plot for Congress doesn't look that different from this one for compound, which suggests way more structure to the conflict within compound than I would have expected. I am not an expert on compound governance. I'm not even going to attempt to interpret this for you, but I just want to give you a hint of where we're heading in our research, is you can actually then, if you have a space like compound where the first two dimensions do a lot of the work in explaining how different people are voting, you can actually plot it and start to look at who's voting with who. And so you could think about clustering this into groups of actors that seem to be, whether intentionally or purely accidentally, voting in similar ways to one another. And that might, for now, this is just kind of fun, but it might lead us to some kind of more mature idea about what is the nature and the scope of conflict within these DAOs, and how can we channel it effectively. There's no a16z's right here, right near the Cal blockchain group.
Hard to pigeonhole us.
Yeah,
We're right there in the middle.
This is the same scree plot for Uniswap, and what it's showing you is it's not nearly as low dimensional. It looks like you need 5 dimensions to sort of like get a good explanation of who's voting on what, and so it's much less structured. I don't know why that is yet, but that's where I want to go in this research, is like take things like this across lots of DAOs and start to understand, well, why are some so structured and why are some less structured?
And back to one slide. So I take it here you looked at sort of specific voters and the corresponding voting vector, and like some normalized projection on each of the two.
I'm just plotting the first and second component from the PCA, yeah.
And like, is it easy to say like the various quadrants, like?
Yeah.
Like, would you summarize it as a political position? Like
Yeah,
more monitoring, less monitoring?
So that's where I want to head. So that is totally possible, but it's completely qualitative. So what you have to do is go back to the loadings, figure out which proposals have high loadings, and then read them and understand what they're about. And that's definitely something I want to hire a bunch of students to do in the near future. Because I do think for context where there is structure, it almost has to be the case that there will be certain issues that are explaining the different quadrants of the space. So yeah, that's exactly where I want to head.
Are there enough proposals that you could just run a text algorithm and try and figure out what automatically?
Potentially, yeah, potentially. People have tried to do that for Congress, and they've never quite cracked like how to do it well, but it's definitely possible.
I thought it worked okay for what was it, the Genskow Shapiro?
Yeah. So you can scale. Yeah. So they already know the dimension of conflict. They're trying to like predict whether you're Republican or Democrat. So they have kind of an easier job, because it's like, I know there are 2 parties and I'm going to see which words predict which party. Here, it's not clear who the parties are, but we could probably discover them by looking at the words that are most associated with the proposals that have the most loading. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you tried looking at like a causality between who votes and like who commits their vote first, or who either on-chain or like off-chain in a forum, who announces first?
Yes. I'm super into this. I haven't done it yet, but it's on our list of things to do. Obviously, the data does have that time dimension in it.
Because none of this voting is private, right?
No, and this is one of the areas I'm most interested in. Dan is, I think, really interested in trying to implement different kinds of private voting, is that we know when voting is public and done over time, it creates super interesting equilibria in voting strategies. And so there's a great paper on this by a friend of mine, Pablo Montañez, about the US Senate, where voting is public and done in like, it's like partially alphabetical, but there's some randomness to it or something. Yeah, it's super cool. Yeah, and there's this kind of unintuitive aspect to it, which is like, in some ways you'd think you'd like to go last, because then you've seen what everyone else does. But then that means that people in front of you, if they know enough about your preferences, can like force you to vote in a particular way by voting in before you, if you're going to be pivotal or something like that. And so it definitely creates all kinds of weirdness. The fact that the voting is public is also super, or quasi-public is also super weird, and you worry about
I just
pathologies.
wonder, like, with that cluster, if they're all making those decisions independently, or if, like, 10 of them just copying somebody else's.
Yeah,
It's something simple like that.
for sure. Yeah, that's definitely a direction we want to go in. Okay, so I just want to wrap up. Where I think this is heading, or like what really excites me, is this idea that there are these classic problems from the history of governance that are relevant to Web3, but Web3 is also different and new in really interesting ways. And the reason I've gotten super excited about this as an academic is that I think we can learn a bunch about governance in general from this space too. And so I just wanted to kind of list out some of the things I think are so interesting. So I've spent my career looking around for natural experiments, because what I tend to do in most of my papers is like collect data on some governance outcome and connect it to some change in the structure of the governance system to try to get at causal effects of like, okay, so you put in place term limits, what happens? Or you allow people to vote by mail, what happens? And you have to search around, and it's super hard because actually most physical world governments aren't changing the rules very often for kind of obvious reasons. And there's tons and tons of friction. But in Web3, people are changing the rules quite frequently. And in fact, one of the things we're doing in our dashboard, or we're trying to do at least, is to actually like automatically detect changes in the governance structure through the smart contracts. And so the hope is it'll be this kind of amazing laboratory where different communities are mutating and changing the rules a lot. And then of course we can get all the data right off the blockchain and understand what the consequences of these reforms were. And so I think it's just a super exciting space that I'm really enthusiastic to do research in. And then the last thing, this is my last slide, is also, I'm not just interested in this as a researcher, I think what's coming out of this already is super, super interesting from a governance perspective in the real world too. And so I mentioned before, I've done a bunch of work outside of academia at very, very large platforms. I'm super interested in the enormous governance challenges that they face, both, as I said, the social legitimacy challenges, but also the challenge of getting buy-in from developers, creators, sellers, and so forth. I think there's just like this potentially really interesting opportunity to democratize these large platforms in kind of the spirit of the glorious revolution that I started this talk with, and to bring democracy to some of these decisions about, hard policies on social media platforms, or policies about how developers make money in app stores, things of that nature, where we could use democracy. It's clear that it won't be direct democracy. Facebook actually tried to do a global referendum. I don't know if any of you remember it. It was a super long time ago. The participation rate was, I think, 3 basis points or something like that. And so they canceled it. I'll talk more about that in my next talk. But representative democracy, the kinds of delegation systems that Web3 is now exploring, I think could be a really big deal for fixing some of these big governance problems in Web 2. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next talk next week. So I'm going to stop here. Love to take any further questions. Thank you. Differences in the data between governance systems focused on tuning protocol parameters and those focused on treasury allocation. I haven't looked at this question yet, but I think it's a really important question. Porter is actually really quite interested in this question. He's pushed me pretty hard on it because I tend to think in terms of democracy, and Porter tends to think in terms of money. And if the purpose of the DAO, I think, matters a lot for what kinds of governance you want to have. And so one thing, for example, Porter really pushed me on is Uniswap is very simple. It doesn't need a complex governance structure, maybe because it's somewhat minimal. Maker is making slightly more complex decisions. Maybe it needs a different structure. If you ever had a successful social media DAO or something, the decisions, I can tell you, having worked at Meta, will be much, much harder. So I do think there are probably different ways to structure them. This goes to this question of the science of this space, what is the optimal structure for each purpose? And in terms of the data, to get at the question directly, no, we haven't looked at that yet. But once we only have a small number of DAOs in the dashboard today, once the dashboard's built out, the goal is to make exactly those kind of comparisons. Is we'll basically have a bunch of attributes of each of these DAOs that you can slice the data by. There'll be some risk of over-interpreting different correlations, which we'll have to be careful about. But my goal will be to get at actually kind of natural experiments of changes in different things that are going on and how they affect governance outcomes. Yeah.
So to follow up on that, do you have like a, I don't know, a short list of dimensions that you would say affect whether you want to have one kind of system versus another one? So like, for example, I can imagine that like one difference between, I don't know, like political governments and corporate shareholders is like, well, not being a corporate shareholder, I assume most of them are just interested in the same objective. They want to maximize profit, but maybe they disagree on the best way to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas like in a political government, everyone genuinely disagrees about what they want to do.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, what are other dimensions? Like, what is that a relevant dimension, and what are the other relevant dimensions? Like, if you had a short list.
I think that first dimension is critical because the governance solutions in a space where you hold a common value and different beliefs is very different from when you have different values. I would say on the corporate shareholder side, two other dimensions that differentiate it in an important way, or one that differentiates it, one that makes it more similar to democracy. The one that differentiates it is the ability of exit. And the ability of exit is critical, and that's obviously to some extent also present in Web3. So how do you create a governance system where people are voting, but they can also quit at any time? You might have kind of like a lower obligation for certain kinds of governance in that space, right? So like part of why social media has become so problematic is the sense that the platforms are so large, in some sense you can't exit. And therefore they need certain kinds of democracy to legitimate themselves that if you can exit, you might not need. So that's another dimension. The third I was going to mention is the accountability problem. So one thing that goes on in corporate shareholder governance is what you're saying is like it's a common value problem, and they're just trying to figure out the best way to run the company. But there's also this principal agent problem, which is I'm over here, I'm a shareholder, and I'm worried that the CEO is enriching him or herself at my expense. And that's pretty similar to problems we see in democratic government and in problems we at least worry about in the Web3 space. So those are some of the dimensions I think are most important, in addition to the one listed out in the chat, which is kind of like, and what is the purpose of this enterprise?
And I have a completely unrelated question to this. Are there any, so like you mentioned that now that things are either more digital or on a blockchain, there's lots of different technical tools that are possible that are not possible with the kind of voting schemes that happened like 10 plus years ago.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, are there any like fancy algorithmic schemes you've seen that actually seem interesting, or do you generally feel positively or negatively towards development of an algorithmic solution?
Yes. I do. I'm probably an optimist compared to the average political scientist on this. I do. I'll give you a few that I think are really interesting. First, I think liquid democracy is genuinely very interesting. I think as I talked about earlier, there's a critical trade-off. And I think liquid democracy as implemented right now is probably too far on one end, but there's a whole spectrum. There's nothing to prevent a form of liquid democracy where there's periodic redelegations or something. I haven't seen anyone study that, but I think that would be really worth exploring. And I think that there's something about that idea that's quite interesting. Another one that might even be more important is just the way you can design the token. And so these ideas about you can kind of like encode into the token any laws you want around how voting works. So things like compulsory voting, I think, are super interesting. Excuse me. But you don't have to make it compulsory. Instead, you can like fine tune the level of incentive or disincentive you give for different types of participation. I think that's super interesting, and related to that, at the same kind of coin, if you will, other side of the coin, bad pun, at the delegation level, you can also create fine-grained incentives. There, like with liquid democracy, I think there's like trade-offs you have to be super careful about. I've seen some stuff, I think Maker actually already does this, and I don't know that it's the way I would do it necessarily, is like trying to create your compensation as a delegate as a function, not only of how much you're delegated to, but also like your participation rate and stuff like that. And I think on the one hand, I think it's super promising because I think if you look at models of accountability, like one of the reasons accountability in elections is so hard is because the power the voter has is so coarse. Like all they can do is hire and fire, which is crappy. And if you look at like, this stuff in labor markets, you get this much more fine-grained incentives because you can pay people and give them bonuses and stuff like that and promote them. And so getting towards that, I think, could be really, really promising. And in fact, I think is so promising, it could even kind of like reflect back into real politics and giving legislators better incentives. But we also know that the problem of being a delegate or a legislator is super multidimensional. And you worry a lot about creating incentives along one dimension at the expense of others. And so we see this kind of like effort allocation problem a lot in politics, where like the only thing you care about as a voter is like how many votes I show up to. Well, I can like, maximize that and then spend no time actually studying the problems that are, and so, we have classic papers on that problem of the multitask problem. So I think that's one where I'm super interested too.
Okay, last follow-up. So like, when you mentioned liquid democracy, it sounds like so far you're kind of like presupposing a certain aggregation rule. It would just still be like a majority vote based after delegation. And like one of the, so like I haven't read a lot, but some papers that get submitted to CS theory conferences are like, what if you cap the, what if you cap the maximum influence any node can have? And like in some models, I don't know, that helps get rid of some, the bad thing effect. And I'm wondering, like, in general, is, like, I don't know if that stuff has even made it to, like, political theorists. Is that kind of thinking helpful or mostly missing the point? Or
yeah, it's interesting. I don't know, but I'll give you just my sense. My sense of what I've seen on liquid democracy so far has been that it's been quite focused on the common value problem, where like you have different beliefs and you're trying to aggregate and stuff. And I'm not aware of any papers in CS or political economy that look at the accountability problem, which is if the delegates are then going off and doing stuff, are they doing a good job? Do they worry about being undelegated to? And I think that difference could be important for your question, because capping the influence of nodes is probably very good from an information aggregation perspective, I would guess. But it seems ambiguous on accountability because it kind of like caps my incentives as a delegate to get more delegation. So I don't know. My real answer is I don't know, but that's my first thought. I think that whole area I think is super ripe. And actually I work with a super interesting political theory professor at the Harris School at U Chicago. His name is Ethan Bueno de Mesquita, who's super interested in these questions. I'm hoping to persuade him to write a paper on liquid democracy and accountability. Lyra asked, what kind of decisions do you think could benefit from votes being secret? Yeah, this is a great question and a passion of mine. So the most important, there are a lot of reasons to think secret voting is valuable. There's some arguments for why it can be bad also. The best arguments for why you want secret voting, I think there's at least two. The first and probably the most important is to prevent vote buying. And vote buying could be good in some circumstances. Like we don't tend to think it's that problematic for someone to come in and buy a bunch of shares in a publicly traded company and like influence the direction of the company through that mechanism. But depending on what the nature of the buying is and what the decisions the DAO is doing, it could be very bad at the minimum for the legitimacy of the organization, but also potentially for the future of the organization, if it's very easy to pay people to vote the way you want them to vote. And this is a big debate. I know there are some like purists who think vote buying is purely good in this space, but I think that we could come with a lot of examples for why it can be very bad. And the whole evolution of the secret ballot or the Australian ballot in democracy was precisely about this. Because in the past, it wasn't secret. You actually, in the US and in many other countries too, you would take a ballot and the ballot would be colored according to which party you were supporting. And the party would watch you put it into the ballot box and then give you a beer. And we've seen a lot of very good benefits from moving to secret voting because it prevents that. If I don't know how you voted, I can't easily pay you to vote the way I want you to vote because you might take my money and not vote the way I wanted you to. So that's like, I think, one way that secret voting can be super useful. The other is in terms of information aggregation. We tend to think, there's sort of like Condorcet jury type things, if you're familiar with that. Like, social dynamics of public voting can be very bad for information aggregation. There's some great work on this in the context of the Federal Open Market Committee, where there's evidence that like they disagree with one another less now that the transcripts and the votes are all public. And you worry about getting this kind of herding, where someone important, someone you care about comes out and says they have a strong position on this issue, your vote's gonna be public. Now you're hesitant to vote, but maybe you have a private signal that what that person thinks is the right thing to do is actually the wrong thing to do. Now we're breaking the information aggregation process. So that's another argument for secret voting. So, and there's lots of others too. Yeah, thank you everyone, I'll leave it there.